We're glad to have you back. You're still watching Business Nigeria. And as Nigeria presses ahead with some of its boldest economic reforms in decades, International Monetary Fund has offered a cautious, optimistic assessment of the country's progress. The verdict came after a 2 weeks mission to Lagos and Abuja for IMF's 2025 Article 5 consultation, which concluded on April 15th. It also came ahead of the IMF 2025 World Bank spring meetings, which began Monday in Washington, D.C., led by Admission Chief Axel Schemling. The IMF's delegation met with senior government officials, including Mr. Wale Edun, Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy, Mr. Abubakar Kyari, Minister of Agriculture and Food Security, Mr. Olayemi Cardoso, Governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, and key figures from the labor unions, private sector, academia, civil society. Their final statement strikes a familiar tone, commendations for reforms momentum, coupled with sober warnings about lingering risk and structural weaknesses. These reforms have put Nigeria in a better position to navigate the external environment, that's according to them. But they also say significant uncertainty remains and more work needs to be done to anchor inflation, expand buffers, and foster private sector-led recovery. Mr. Robert Omotunde is the Chief Investment Officer. He's with AfriInvest Assets Management Limited West Africa. He's my guest. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you. Always a pleasure to be here.
Well, IMF is giving a nod. At the same time, they are warning us that we need to do some things, I think, to address the fallouts. How does this come to you? What do you make of IMF's nod with regards to these reforms and the fallout that we've seen, some positives in recent times?
Yes, so the reality on ground now is that the government has taken some steps and have implemented some bold reforms. I think since this current government came in May 2023, you will recall that we had some very quick policy moves, such as the removal of subsidy, which we have, we'd always been crying out before then that, it was not doing Nigeria any good. So the government took that bold step to remove petroleum subsidy. Now, we've seen reforms in the electricity sector, the two together constituting Nigerian energy sector, where we have also seen implementation of cost-effective tariffs, which is still ongoing anyways. And then you've seen implementation of the flexible foreign exchange framework, which we didn't have before then. We had fragmented market as far as foreign exchange market was concerned. So if you look at those three bold reforms, removal of petroleum subsidy, electricity, what do you call it now? Electricity subsidy, if I may say.
That's true.
As well as, currency subsidy, that we had, the government pulled the plug almost at the same time. It was the right thing to do, I must say, because there was no reason for us to continue to, subsidize petroleum products and be more or less subsidizing the entire, the neighboring countries to, in our West African region. At least those countries bordering us in the north, south, east, and west were subsidizing them, because the differential in price in petroleum products in Nigeria compared to those countries was, the spread was good enough to, to bribe the way all through to get the products out of the country. Now, you will see that after that was done, we are beginning to see some respite. There are still, concerns as to whether we have fully deregulated that sector, in terms of... Yes. So there are concerns around that. But the step the government has taken, it's a very bold one. So IMF is alluding to some of these bold reforms, which aligns with what IMF is typically known for.
What they've been talking about all the while.
They've been talking about it, since the previous government for 8 years.
Yes, true.
Right? One of the things the IMF lauded, of the current government is the printing, what you call helicopter money, monetary financing, where the government, the central bank is printing money to fund the budget of government. Now, this government has been able to put a stop to that. But if you look at the impact, for instance, when the government was printing money to fund the budget, it had inflationary pressure from a demand side, where you had much money coming into the system without corresponding economic activity, accompanying it. But in this case, what we are now seeing is a situation where, people now have to pay for I mean, they have to pay the real price, the real market price for all the economic activities generated, either in electricity or in petroleum.
All subsidies out.
Or all subsidies out, right?
I get that
and
point.
the result also has implication for the general price level. Yeah. And government did a good one also, rebasing our inflation figure, right? I mean, the statistical computation for inflation was rebased. You know, new, I mean, items, the weighting of the items were changed and all of those. And it also helped to moderate inflation a bit, albeit mathematical. So what IMF is now talking about is all of these bold reforms which we lauded, they have also come with it some of the, you know, consequences that you have to deal with. One of which is, you know, the country and how fragile it has become. You know, the income level of people are not improving as much. And then they have to pay all of this, coupled with the fact that you are now seeing the ripple effect, particularly of the increase in petroleum prices, as well as increase in, flexible foreign exchange, which has now resulted in higher exchange rate. You know, the implication of that is feeding into other aspects of the economy, right? And Nigerians are crying. So, and these are some of the things that, you know, IMF was now trying to talk about, that you may need to have to see how you deal with some of these consequences. Plus the fact that monetary policy is still hanging on a balance.
And they're still saying we should tighten.
You know, they are saying we should tighten more. But we have seen a slowdown from the central bank, of course, because of the rebasing exercise, which was a good one to do, except for the fact that the last inflation we saw inflation increasing by 3.9% on a month-to-month basis. That is quite high. You know, remember, when the rebasing was done, we printed at around 24%. And then it moderated, you know, February inflation moderated to about 23, and now we are back to 24. Because of the month-on-month inflation. But it is notable that food inflation was slower in terms of growth, right? Does that mean that something, you know, laudable is also happening, you know, in terms of the food market? We cannot tell for a certain whether that is a sustainable model that we will now see going forward. But definitely, government is dealing with a lot, and we must, you know, we must be clear about the fact that the government is trying as much as possible to save the country. You know, albeit there are, you know, things here and there that you can still talk about that the government can do better. That's where I want us to hear. But where we are now, the government has done. So it's not, in a Nigerian situation, when the government came in, was like a child that's, you know, was in coma, and that you needed to bring out of coma. So I think what the government did initially was doing all those tough measures to get us out of coma. So, but now we are out of coma, still unstable, but at least there is a sign of life. You know, then you now need to start, taking baby steps to apply the drugs, you know, check before applying and ensuring that things are balanced. I think that is the complex work that the government is now having to face at this time. Is that where the interventions come in? Because before we get to the interventions, because I also read that report, and IMF is saying Nigeria remains vulnerable to external shocks, domestic inflationary pressure. We see what's happening with tariffs and how Trump's liberation moves and all of that, how it's affecting us. So what... I've always asked these questions that if we want targeted interventions, government needs to understand that something really needs to be done, because when we go around the streets, we journalists, we ask questions, we get comments from people, while some will say, oh, it's a step in the right direction. Some will say more needs to be done. So when we say more, where are those interventions? People are saying, no, NNPC must not, no more subsidies. We're not going to introduce any subsidy for electricity. Government has even said, no, that's never going to happen. How do we try to address the fallout? You see, going the way of intervention takes us back to where we're coming from. You know, one of the things we've analyzed is the fact that, you see, the fact that you have, you know, market-reflective prices across board, that in itself brings in the discipline, you know, to households, even to, you know, institutions and government alike, you know, compared to when you would buy a liter of petrol for, you know, less than 200 naira. And now you have to pay as much as 800 naira. You know, at that time, people will they'll go to places they don't need to go.
Leave the cars on, the ACs are on.
Do you understand? So a lot of wastage is going on.
Yeah.
Now, plus the fact that the government, the finances of government could not even support it. Not then, not now. You see what I mean? Not then, not now. So what then that means is that we have started on the right path. I mean, if we say that Nigeria still has, you know, when you analyze our country from a per capita income basis, you see that we are lower than some other countries. But in terms of the overall size of the economy, you know, you will say Nigeria is bigger than a Ghana, a Cameroon, a Republic of Benin. Do you understand?
Yes.
A Niger Republic, right? Yes. So, but these are neighboring economies to us that are not subsidizing these products, you know, that we were subsidizing.
You see what long ago.
Oh, long ago, they've stopped that. So, which means that, and then plus the fact that you now have porous borders, you know, that will not allow that, even when you are subsidizing to, you know, help your own citizens, you can't be sure that those things will not get their ways out of the border. So, intervention, let's put it on a pause. Now, what then can the government do? You know, as it is now, the budget for 2025 is already challenged.
It is.
Yes, because of, you know, the liberation movement of Donald Trump.
Oil prices already.
Oil prices now, we are printing at about 65 when our benchmark is $75 a barrel.
Yes.
Now, it then means that the government may now need to look towards borrowing again. Of which the borrowing of government is being quite heavy recently, such that the debt service to revenue ratios and all of our debt sustainability ratios are deteriorating. So that the government will continue to borrow, you know, sustainably is now in question. So what that means, what that means also is that, you know, there's something that we call fiscal consolidation. Fiscal consolidation is when you look at the overall budget of government and you try to deliberately reduce your expenditure profile while also reducing your debts, you know, your debt profile at the same time. Now, what that is supposed to help us to do is to look inward, right? I believe that there is a part of our budget. You know, we've been doing this incremental budgeting, you know, for the last 10 years or probably the last 20 years, when we don't really look at it and say, you know, what are the critical aspects of the economy that we really need to focus on. You know, so one of the areas we are going to be able to help in this instance is to reduce wastages, right? Government will need, corruption is still, you know, in the mix. You know, the more we can reduce the incidences of corruption, the more we can save for critical infrastructure. Probably the more or the less you can borrow. Do you understand? Because if we don't have to spend, because corruption is reduced, then you won't have to borrow to fund those corruption, you know, and all other things that, you know, are inefficient within government. So that's still one aspect. But that we are going to have a, you know, an easy path toward, I mean, to getting out of where we are now. I'm not sure any, you know, good economist will predict that, because we have taken very, you know, stupid decisions in the past. You know, not this government, the accumulation of all the governments in the past. Now, to now do the right thing, you're going to take some pains. And that's what the government, I mean, the country is currently facing. Where we think the government can make a difference is enabling the business environment to flourish. You know, the last time I was in the studio, we were discussing the new tax law, you know, and how much of it is going to help in even encouraging new businesses that are coming up. There is no doubt that if we must get us out of the current situation that we are in, the private sector will play a key role. But when you look at the capital importation coming into the country, it means that we are not still getting some things right yet. I mean, if you look at the figure, Q3 capital importation, you know, data relative to Q2 was worse off, you know, and it's across board from foreign direct investment to foreign portfolio investment. Now, and you know, foreign direct investment is really a measure as to whether the policy of government is hitting the right targets. Because when we are hitting the right target, we will see flows coming to invest in the real sector, not just the hot money that comes to buy our equities or bonds or money market securities. You know, so they are hot money, and the way they come in is the way they go out. So the more we can attract this foreign direct investment to come into the country. I mean, just before I came up, you were talking about the oil and gas sector and how much of investment should go into that space. Is it not appalling that for many years we are still within the 2 million barrels per? I mean, even now we are below 2 million barrels per day.
Yeah, at the point we're even almost 1 million.
1 million barrels per day. So, which means that that's still one aspect. You know, if we are able to unlock all of the value, and I like the perspective of the professor, which is that, see, energy transition that we talk about, there is real energy need, right? I mean, as we are transitioning into renewable, it's still going to take some time. Why don't we unlock all the values possible? I can still predict that in the next 10 years, you know, we will still have, you know, these fossil sources of energy with us. So why don't we unlock all of the benefits that we can get? Oil and gas is one thing that we know we have as a country. So let's unlock all of the value that we can get in that. Because if we do, it will reduce the borrowing of government, you know, which is more or less killing the economy as we speak and crowding out the private sector. Even the private sector is finding it tough to access funding from, you know, capital market and other sources because the government is crowding out that part. So, you know, we must get to know that, see, there are no easy way out, right? Tough choices have been taken, and we're going to have to sustain that path to get us out of the current situation that we found ourselves.
Oh, well, interesting conversation, but we have 1-2 minutes to go.
Oh, yeah.
What are your projections looking forward with the pretty figures we've seen? Net reserves from the CBN came up pretty good. We also got a balance of payments, I think, also came up pretty well this time around.
That's
if
correct.
we look at all of this, are you seeing us sustaining this momentum?
Well, I think that the news about the net reserve is quite positive. Because, you know, at a point, there were a lot of speculations. You know, I mean, you recall that 2023 JP Morgan report, I think that came out earlier in 2024, you know, that Nigeria's net reserve was barely $3 billion, dollars.
Yeah.
And I think that
was scary,
yes, that was scary. But I think the government came out, the central bank's report showed that the net reserve in 2023 was actually around $4 billion. But 2024, we are now at 23.1 billion. That is impressive, you know, because you see that reserve is what is going to sustain the effort that the central bank is making in stabilizing the currency. Because again, one area you will look at in terms of our currency pricing is that perhaps we shouldn't be where we are on a relative basis. I mean, if you check, like I mentioned, all the neighboring countries, look at Cameroon, look at Ghana,
these countries around.
Look at Republic of Benin, look at, you know, Niger Republic, check their currency relative to the dollars. You find that Nigeria is the highest, you know, and these are economies that are not doing as well as we are doing. So it means that something is fundamentally wrong with the pricing of our currency, you know, currently printing at about 1/6 at the parallel market. So it means that we can get that figure lower than what it is now. And what will help the government to achieve that is the reserves, the much of reserve that the central bank can boast of, you know. So the outlook will be pretty good from that perspective, knowing that we have a reserve that can support it. But, you know, from the borrowing perspective, the government still needs to borrow. And I'm not quite sure with the level of oil prices now that domestic borrowing alone will do it for the government. So we might have instances where we need to go to the, you know, external, you know, market to borrow, you know, with all of the vulnerabilities in that space, given that pricing in the, you know, in the Eurobonds market, for example, has, you know, gone up by at least 200 to 300 basis points. So it means that right timing, even if the government need to look to external borrowing, will be very appropriate so that we are not just taking much debt burden on our neck. You know, the debt burden is real.
It's real. It's heavy.
And the
scary too.
Yes, very scary. Honestly. You know, and it is going to, you know, over time, if government is not watching that, it can incapacitate the government, the ability of the government to, you know, really embark on critical infrastructure projects. As you can see now, with the oil prices falling by up to $10, you know, a barrel, the implication could be that the capital projects may suffer because, you know, government must keep running. You can't shut down government. So the recurrent part of government expenditure will still get expended. But, you know, what then happens to capital projects? And those capital projects are what we need to catalyze the economy again and get us to the path of growth.
Interesting analysis as always.
Thank you for
Mr. Robert Omotunde is Chief Investment Officer, AfriVest West Africa. You and Prof today, not enough time to have our discussion, but I must thank you so much for your time coming into this studio.
That's what I also studied in school, like Prof said.
So you're doing this also part of what? Thank you so much.